Hi everyone, welcome back to Where the Red Fern Grows Read Aloud. Today we are going to be reading chapter 10 of Where the Red Fern Grows. Chapter 9 we finished yesterday and Billy has officially skinned his first coon. It was quite an experience that he dealt with, very persistent, him and his hounds. Not only did he catch his coon, but the biggest tree in the woods came down with it. Big tree. And Billy is firmly now believing that because he asked for God's help in prayer, that our God has helped him knock that tree down to get his coon. So we're going to be jumping into chapter 10 right now. Let's see what chapter 10 has in store for us. Mama made a cap out of my first coon hide. I was as proud as Papa would have been if someone had given him a dozen Missouri mules. Mama said afterwards that she wished she hadn't made it for me because in some way wearing a cap must have affected my mind. I went coon crazy. I was out after the ringtails every night. About the only time I didn't go hunting was when weather was bad. And even then, Mama all but had to hog tie me. What a wonderful night they were, running like a deer through the thick timber of bottoms, tearing my way through stands of wild cane, climbing over drifts of jumping logs, running, screaming, yelling, woo-wee, get 'em, boy, get 'em, following the voices of my little hounds. It wasn't too hard for a smart old coon to fool old Dan, but there were none that prowled the riverbanks that could fool my little Ann. As Grandpa had predicted, the price of coon skins jumped sky high. A good-sized hide was worth from $4 to $10 depending on the grade and quality. Keep in mind, this is back in the older days where the price, that's a lot of money for these coon hides. And coon hides are the raccoon skins, okay? I kept the side of our smokehouse plastered with hides. Of course, I would spread them out a little to cover more space. I always stretched them on the side facing the road, never to the back side. I wanted everyone in the country to see them. The money earned from the furs was turned over to my father. I didn't care about it. I had what I wanted, my dogs. I suppose that Papa was saving it for something because I never saw anything new turn up around our house. But like any young boy, I wasn't bothered by it. I asked no questions. My whole life was wrapped up in my dogs. Everywhere I went, they went along. There was only one place I didn't want to go with me. That was to Grandpa's store. Other dogs were always there, and it seemed as if they all wanted to jump old Dan. I got so about the only time I went to see my grandfather was when I had a bundle of fur to take to the store. This was always a problem. In every way I could, I tried to slip away from my dogs somewhere. Sometimes I swore that they could read my mind. It made no difference that I tried. I couldn't fool them. One time I was sure I outsmarted them. The day before I was to make one of my trips, I took my furs out to the barn and hid them. The next morning, I hung around the house for a while and then nonchalantly whistled my way out of the barn. I climbed up in the loft and peeked through the crack. I could see them laying in the front of their doghouse. There they were. They weren't even looking my way. Taking my furs, I sneaked out through the back of the door. While walking a tomcat, I made it to the timber. I climbed a small wood tree house and looked back. They were still there and didn't seem to know I was gone. What I had done. Feeling just about as smart as Sherlock Holmes, I headed to the store. I was walking along, singing my lungs out when they came tearing out of underbrush, wiggling and twisting and tackling and tickled to death to be with me. At first, I was mad, but one look at dancing little Ann and all was forgiven. I sat on my bundle of fur and laughed till it hurt all over. I could scold them a little, but I could no more have whipped one of them than I could kiss a girl. than I could have kissed a girl. After all, a boy just doesn't whip his dogs. Grandpa always counted my furs carefully and marked something down on a piece of paper. I'd never seen him do that with any other hunters as it got the best of my curiosity. One day while he was writing, I asked him, "Why do you do that, Grandpa?" He looked over at me, over his glasses, and said, kind of sharp, "Never mind. I have my reason." When Grandpa talked to me like that, I didn't push things any further. Besides, I didn't make any difference to me if he marked on every piece of paper in the store. I always managed to make my trips on Saturdays, as that was coon hunter day. I didn't have to stand around outside of the circle anymore and listen to the coon hunters. I'd get right up in the middle and say my piece with the rest of them. I didn't have to tell any whompers for some of the things my dogs did were almost unbelievable anyhow. Oh, I guess I did make things a little bigger than they actually were, but I never did figure a coon hunter told honest to goodness lies. He just kind of stretched things a little bit. So you're not really lying, he's just kind of exaggerating a little. I could hold those coon hunters spellbound with some of my hunting tales. Grandpa could never say anything while I was telling my stories. He just puttered around the store with a silly little grin on his face. Once in a while, when I got too far off the beaten path, he would come around and cram a bar of soap in my pocket. My grandpa would get all red. I'd cut my story short, fly out the door, and head home. The coon hunters were always kidding me about my dogs. Some of the remarks I heard made me fighting mad. I never saw hounds so small, but I guess they are hounds. At least they look like it. I don't believe little Ann is half as smart as he says she is. So, she's so little, those old coons think she's a rabbit. I bet she sneaks right up on them before they realize she's a dog. Some of these nights, a big old coon is going to carry her off to his den and raise some little coon puppies. So those are the hunters picking at Billy about his little Ann, making jokes about his dog that he says he gets all upset with. I always took their kidding with a smile on my face, but it made my blood boil like water in Mama's tea kettle. I had a way of shutting them up. Letting all go in the store. I'd say, and see who has the most hides in there. It was true that my dogs were small, especially little Ann. She could walk under an ordinary hound, in fact. She was a regular midget. If it had not been for her long ears, no one could have told she was a hound. Her actions weren't those of a hunting hound. She was constantly playing. She would play with the chickens and young calves with a piece of paper or corn cob. With my little girl lacked in size, she made up with sweetness. She could make friends with any tomcat. Old Dan was just the opposite. He strutted around in the belligerent and tough attitude. Although he was a tall dog, he was heavy. His body was long and his chest broad and thick. His legs were short, big, and solid. The muscles in his body were as hard and knotty. When he walked, they would twist and jerk under his skin. He's a friendly dog. There were no strangers to him. He loved everyone, yet he was a strange dog. He would not hunt with any hound other than little Ann, or any hunter, not even my father. The strange thing about old Dan was that he would not hunt even with me unless little Ann was with him. So they're talking about old Dan, how he won't hunt with anyone, not his father, and he won't even hunt with Billy unless little Ann is with him. That's pretty interesting. I found this out the first night I tried. Little Ann had cut the pad of her right foot on the sharp jagged flint rock. It was a nasty cut. I made a little boot of leather and put it on her wounded foot. To keep her from following me, I locked her in the corn crib. 2 nights later, I decided to take old Dan hunting for a while. He followed me to the river bottom and disappeared in the thick timber. I waited and waited for him to strike a trail. Nothing happened. About 2 hours, I called him. He didn't come. I called and called. Disgusted, I gave up and went home. Coming up through the barn lot, I saw him rolled up in a ball on the ground in front of the corn crib. I immediately understood. I walked over and opened the door. He jumped up in the crib, smelled little Anne's foot, twisted around in the shucks, and laid down by her side. As he looked at me, I read the message in his friendly gray eyes. You couldn't have done this a long time ago. I never knew. I never did know if little Anne would hunt by herself or not. I'm sure she would have, but she was a smart and understanding dog, but I never tried to find out. Little Anne was my sister's pet. They rubbed and scratched and petted her. They would take her down to the creek and give her baths. She loved it. If Mama wanted a chicken caught, she would call Little Anne. She would run the chickens down and hold them with her paw until Mama came. Not one feather would be harmed. Mama tried old Dan once before she got the chicken. There wasn't much left but the feathers. So Little Anne's a lot softer, and of course, old Dan is a little rougher, male and female, maybe characteristics in these dogs. By some strange twist of nature, Little Anne was destined to go through life without being a mother. Perhaps it was because she was stunted in growth, or maybe because she was a runt of her large litter. That may have something to do with it. During the first season, November through February, I was given complete freedom from work. Many times I had came home, the sun was high in the sky. After each hunt, I always took care of my dogs. The flint rocks and straw and saw briars were hard on their feet. With bottles of peroxide and a can of salve, I would doctor their wounds. I never knew what to expect from old Dan. I never saw a coon hound so determined or one that I could get into so many predicaments. More than one time I would have been to death of him if it hadn't been for smart little Anne. One night, not long after I had entered the bottoms, my dog struck a trail of old boar coons. He was a smart old fella and had a sack full of tricks. He crossed the river time after time, finally swimming to the middle and staying in the swift current. He swam downstream. Knowing he would have to come out somewhere, my dog split up. Old Dan took the right side, little Anne worked her way the other side. I came out from the bottoms into the gravel bar and stood and watched them in the moonlight. Little Anne worked down river and then she came back up. I saw her when she passed me going up the bank, sniffing and searching for the trail. She came back to me. I patted her head, scratched her ears, and talked to her. She kept staring across the river to where old Dan was searching for the trail. She waded in and swam across to help him. I knew that the coon had not come out of the river on her side. If he had, she would have found the trail. I walked up to the riffle, pulled off my shoes, and waded across. My dog worked the riverbank up and down. They circled far out into the bottoms. I could hear out snuffling of old Dan. He was bewildered and mad. I was getting a thrill from it all. I had never seen them fooled like this. Old Dan gave up on his side, piled into the river, and swam across to the side little Anne had worked. I knew that this was useless for him to do that. I was on the point of giving up, calling them to me and going elsewhere to hunt. Even when I heard the bawl of little Anne, I couldn't believe what I heard. She was bawling on a trail. She was sounding the tree bark. I hurried down the bank. There was a loud splash. I saw old Dan swimming back. By this time, little Anne was really singing a song. In the bright moonlight, I could see old Dan clearly. His powerful front legs were churning the water. Then I saw a sight that made a hunter's heart swell with pride. Still swimming, old Dan raised his head high out of the water and bawled. He couldn't wait until he reached the bank to tell little Anne he was coming. From far out in the river, he told her. Reaching the shallow, he plowed out of the river into the sandbar. Not even taking time to shake the water off his body again, he raised his head and bawled and tore out down the bank. In a trot, I followed, whooping to let them know I was coming. Before I reached the tree, old Dan's deep voice was making the timber shake. The tree was a large birch, standing right on the bank of the river. The swift current had eaten away the footing, causing it to lean. The lower branches of the tree dangled in the water. I saw how smart the old coon had pulled his trick. Coming in toward the bank from the midstream, he had caught the dangling limb and climbed it up. Exhausted from the long swim, he stayed there in the birch thinking he could outsmart my dogs. I couldn't understand how little Anne found him. It was impossible to fall the tree toward the bottoms. It was too much off balance. I did the next big thing. I cut the longer elder switch, unbuckling one of my suspenders. I tied it to the end and climbed the tree. The coon was sitting in a fork of a limb. Taking my switch, I whooped him a good one, and out he came. He sailed out of the river, with a loud splash. He hit the water and swam for the other side. My dogs jumped off the bank after him. There was no match against his expert swimming. On reaching the other end, he ran down river. Climbing down out of the tree, I picked up my axe and lantern. I trotted down to the other riffle and waded across. I could tell by the bawling of my dogs they were close to the coon. He would have climbed a tree or be caught on the ground. After at once their voices stopped. I stood still and waited for them to bawl treed. Nothing happened. Thinking the coon had taken to the river again, I waited to give them time to reach the opposite bank. I waited and I waited. I could hear nothing. By then I knew they had not crossed over. I thought perhaps they had caught him on the ground. I hurried on. I came to a point where a slot of crystal clear water ran into the river. On the other side was a bluff. I could hear one of my dogs over there. As I watched and waited, I heard a dog jump in the water. It was little Ann. She swam across and came up to me. Staying with me for just a second, she jumped in the slot and swam back to the other side. I could hear her sniffing and whining. I couldn't figure out where old Dan was. By squatting down and holding the lantern over my head, I could dimly see the opposite bank. Little Ann was running up and down. I noticed she always stayed in one place of about 25 yards, never leaving the small area. She ran down to the water's edge, stared out into the slough. The horrible thought came that old Dan had drowned. I knew a big coon was capable of drowning a dog in water, but by climbing on his head and forcing him underwater. As fast as I could run, I circled the slough, climbed up over the bluff, came down to where little Ann was. She was hysterical, running up and down the bank and whining. I tied my lantern on a long pole, held it out over the water, and looked for old Dan's body. I could see clearly in the clear spring waters, but I couldn't see my dog anywhere. I sat down on the bank, buried my face in my hands, and cried. I'm sure he was gone. Several minutes passed, and all the time little Ann had never stopped. Running here and there along the bank, she's sniffing and whining. I heard when she started digging. I looked around. She was 10 feet from the water's edge. I got up and went over to her. She was digging in a small hole about the size of a big apple. Small hole, the size of a big apple. It was the air hole from the muskrat den. I pulled little Ann away from the hole, knelt down, put my ear to it. I could hear something. I could feel vibrations on the ground. It was an eerie sound. It seemed to be coming from far away. I listened. Finally, I understood what the noise was. The voice was old Dan. Little Ann had opened a hole Little Ann had opened a hole up enough with her digging so his voice could be heard faintly. In some way, he had gotten into the old muskrat den. I knew that down under the bank in the water, the entrance to the den could be found. Rolling up my sleeves, I tried to find it with my hands. I had no luck. It was too far down. There was only one thing I could do. Leaving my axe and lantern, I ran for home. Picking up a long handled shovel, I hurried back. The sun was high in the sky before I dug old Dan out. It was a sight to see him. Nothing but mud from the tip of his nose to the end of his tail. I held on his collar and led him down the river to wash him off. The water there was much warmer than the cold spring water of the slough. After washing him, I turned him loose. Right back to the hole he ran. Little Ann was already digging. I knew the coon was still there. Working together, we dug him out. After the coon was killed, I saw what had made him so. After the coon was killed, I saw what had made him so smart. His right front foot was twisted and shriveled. At one time, he must have caught in the coon trap in the trap and had pulled himself free. He was an old coon. His face was almost white. He was big and heavy and had beautiful fur. Tired, muddy, wet, hungry, I started for home. I often wondered how old Dan got into the old muskrat den. Perhaps it was another entrance and I overlooked. I never knew. One night far back in the mountains in a place called the Cyclone Timber, old Dan really pushed a good one. Many years before my time, a terrible cyclone had ripped its way through the mountains, leaving its scars in the form of fallen timber, twisted and snarled. The path of the cyclone was several miles wide and several miles long. It was a wonderful place to hunt as it abandoned with game. My dogs had struck a tail of a coon about an hour before. They had really been warming it up. I knew it was about time for him to take up the tree. And sure enough, I heard the deep voice of old Dan telling the world he had a coon up in the tree. I was trotting along, going to them when his voice stopped. I could hear little Ann, but not old Dan. I wondered why. Was little Ann scared? For I knew just something had happened. Then I heard his voice. It seemed louder than it had been before. I felt much better. When I came up to the tree, I thought little Ann had treed old Dan. She was sitting on her hunches, staring up and bawling at the tree bark. There, a good 15 feet from the ground, with his hind legs planted firmly in the center of the tree, a big limb in his front feet against the trunk of the tree, stood old Dan, bawling for all he was worth. Above him, some 8 or 9 feet, was a baby coon. I was glad it was a younger one, for it had been an old one. He would have jumped out. Old Dan would have followed, and surely would have broken all of his legs. For where I was standing, I could see it was impossible for old Dan to climb the tree. It was dead and more of an old snag than a tree. The limbs were crooked and twisted. The bark was rotten away and fallen off, leaving the bark bare and slick as glass. It was a good 10 feet up for the first limb. I couldn't figure out how old Dan had climbed that tree, but there had to be a solution somewhere. Walking around to the other side, I saw how he accomplished his feat. There in the bottoms was a large hole. The old tree was hollow. Stepping back, I looked up and could see another hole, which had been hidden from me because old Dan's body. He had simply crawled into the hole at the bottoms, climbed up the hollow of the tree, and worked his way on the limb. In some way, he had turned around, reared up, placing his feet against the trunk. There he was. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't cut the tree down. I was afraid to climb it for fear I would scare the coon onto jumping out. If he did, old Dan would jump too and break his legs. I ran plan after plan around my mind. Nothing would work. I finally came to the conclusion that I had to climb the tree, get a hold of that crazy dog. I blew out my lantern, pulled off my shoes and socks, and started shooting up the tree. I prayed that the coon wouldn't jump out. Inching along, being as quiet as I could, I made it up to old Dan, grabbed his collar. I sat on the limb and held him tight. He would bawl now and then and burst but my eardrum. I couldn't drop him to the ground. I couldn't climb down with him. I couldn't sit there on the limb and hold him that night. I would be no better off when daylight came. So Billy has found himself in another little situation. Old Dan has climbed this tree. This tree is very old, and there's a baby coon there. And so he's thinking about all these plans to do, and he still hasn't found a solution for it. Glancing at the hole by my side gave me a solution to my problem. I thought, if he came out this hole, he can go back in. That was the way I got my dog down from the tree. This had its problem too. The first place, old Dan didn't want to be put in a hole head first. By scolding, pushing, shoving, and squeezing, I finally got him started his way. Like a fool, I sat there on the limb, waiting to see him come out of the bottom. And came out he did, turning around, bawling as he did, right back in the hole he went. There was nothing I could do but sit and wait. I understood why his voice had stopped for a while. He just put time out to climb a tree. Putting my ear to the hole, I could hear him coming. Grunting and clawing up he came. I helped him out of the hole. He turned him around and crammed him back in. That time wasn't too gentle with my work. I was tired of sitting on the limb and my bare feet were getting cold. I started down the same time he did. He beat me down. Looking over my shoulder, I saw him turn around and head back for the hole. It wasn't far from the ground, so I let him go. The flint rocks didn't feel too good on my feet when I landed. I jumped to the hole just in time to see the tip end of his long tail disappear. I grabbed it, holding it with one hand. I worked his legs down with my other and pulled him out. I stopped his tree climbing and crammed rocks and chunks into the hole. How the coon stayed in the tree, I'll never know, but stay he did. With a well-aimed rock, I scared him out. Old Dan satisfied his lust to kill. I started for home. I'd had all the hunting I wanted for the night. And that is the end of chapter 10. Okay, so Billy has taken a break from hunting. He had some free time. So what did he do? He continued out into the woods with his two dogs, Old Dan and Little Ann. And they are sure getting a lot of experiences. They're getting to a lot of situations. There's just a lot of experiences going on with a boy and his dog in the woods. Very interesting, very, very interesting to know little characteristics about these dogs, such as Old Dan will not be hunting if Little Ann is not with them. Things like that, how Little Ann is small for her breed, but she's one smart dog. So I really enjoy this book, and we shall see what Monday's chapter 11 has in store for us. Make sure you're watching and posting anything that you can in the comments. So till next week, have a great weekend ahead. Bye, everyone.